Hi everyone, it's Reagan here. Today I'm here with Professor Allensworth, and Professor Allensworth teaches first year contracts and upper level antitrust courses here at Vanderbilt. When she's not teaching, you might find her adding to her extensive resume and research, appearing on multinational news networks, providing testimony in congressional hearings, or even being cited by the Supreme Court. Today, Professor Allensworth is here to talk to us about her most recent publication, The Licensing Racket: How do we decide who is allowed to work and why it goes wrong? So just to get us started, what inspired you to write a book about professional licensing?
Well, I had a professor of my own that when I started out as a professor, he said, he was a mentor of mine, he said, it's always bothered me that the professions get a free pass under the antitrust laws. Those are cartels. They're run by these licensing boards. Members of the profession are on those boards. We should write something about how they ought to be subject to antitrust scrutiny. So we wrote that article. That article was cited by the Supreme Court. And because I didn't have tenure at that time, I kind of ran with that football across the tenure line. I wrote 2 more law review articles about professional licensing, and then I had 3 articles and I had tenure, and I thought, well, maybe now it's time to write a book. And when I did that, I really wanted to change my methodology. I didn't want to be on Westlaw and just reading cases and reading statutes. I really wanted to see on the ground what I saw as sort of cartels, these licensing boards, what they were really doing. And so Nashville is the capital of Tennessee, and so that allowed me to go to many licensing board meetings, and that's kind of how I started writing the book.
Awesome. Okay, well that's a very helpful context. And then just to kind of get into the substance of the book, could you give us a quick overview of how licensing in America works?
Yeah, so I have found that about 1 in 5 American workers has to have what I call a professional license. That is, you can't do your work unless the state says you can, so you have to have a permission slip. And you get that permission only by investing in your human capital to a substantial degree. So this would be a year or more of education, a major exam. The licensed professions that we're most familiar with would be like medicine, law, but actually this kind of regulation, usually overseen by a professional licensing board in the state, covers so many workers and so many professions now. It includes auctioneers and of course barbers, cosmetologists, things that we wouldn't have thought of as sort of like what we might have called the learned professions that were traditionally licensed.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know that auctioneers had to be licensed. That's so crazy.
Auctioneers, alarm system installers until recently in Tennessee.
Oh, wow.
Court reporters, a lot of professions are licensed.
Okay, and so also in the book you say that about 20% of the American workforce, they are licensed professionals, so that's like tens of millions of people to my count. How did this regime become so, invasive and so expansive?
Yeah, it is tens of millions of workers, and it's more than are in unions. I call it the most important legal regulatory institution we have. And it maybe isn't even quite right to call it an institution because it is actually almost 2,000 institutions. There are, you actually are an RA for me, and I recently asked you to track down, all the medical boards in the country, and it's actually more than 50 medical boards in the country, as you now well know. Well, multiply that times all the different professions I just mentioned, you have a ton of boards. And the answer to the question of how we got here to where we have almost 2,000 state licensing boards and almost 300 professions licensed in at least one state is that it started with medicine. It quickly spread to law. This is back in the 19th century. And they were making arguments about, public safety, and the public should know about what they're getting from these professionals. We need to regulate ourselves, but use the state as kind of a backstop, like, we're going to regulate ourselves, but the state's going to say you can't work unless you're in this particular club. So they made that case to the state. Medicine did, law did, and it worked. And it was like that for a while. Learned professions that involve very complicated work, dangerous work. In the 1970s, however, it really started accelerating and expanding to other kinds of work. And I think part of the answer to why that happened is because the professions themselves wanted it that way. They wanted the sort of protection from competition that licensing afforded them, and I think importantly they wanted the prestige of having that kind of state imprimatur on what they did, the license on the wall, the same as a doctor. So it just really started expanding in the 70s, and it really has not slowed down.
You framed the licensing problem in terms of being locked in and locked out. So what do those terms mean, and what are their effects on the professions that they're kind of impacting?
Yeah, so, I went into the licensing board research, going to these meetings with kind of an antitrust perspective on what these boards were doing. And that was informed by the fact that I'm an antitrust professor and I had written these articles about that. And what I expected to see was that they were going to keep competition out by keeping barriers to entry really high. If they ever had a chance to interpret state law to be more constrictive of who can practice, they were going to take that opportunity. If they ever saw an opportunity to go against somebody who may be working on the margins of the profession and say, no, you need a license, they were going to do that, because that's the way that you get sort of economic benefits from licensure, is if you're able to keep down the number of providers. And so I call this locked out. Another metaphor that I actually heard a board member use is a fence, right? The fence around the profession, the kind of high barrier to the profession. And I did see boards do that. That hypothesis, that sort of antitrust hypothesis, was confirmed. They erect high barriers to entry when they're given the opportunity. They have lots of turf wars about where that fence lies, with between not doctors and nurses, for example, or between acupuncturists and chiropractors. There's all these little turf wars going on. And I found over the years that these requirements go up and up and up in sort of a ratchet effect. So that's the first half of the book. Oh, and by the way, what happens when you do this is not only does price go up, but scarcity goes up, right? So the unavailability of the services are a real problem. That's particularly devastating in medicine and in law, where you have a big access to justice problem. So that's locked out. What I didn't expect to see is that when it came to discipline, when it came to deciding who gets to stay in the profession, who gets to have a clean license, the boards were very unwilling or unable to come down hard on the professionals that really ought not to be practicing. They gave second chances, third chances, fourth chances to professionals that you and I would see as obviously unqualified. Obviously, they've used their license to traffic in narcotics. They've used their license to abuse their patients. The kinds of things that we really ostensibly want a board there to protect against. They were letting these professionals continue to practice. And so that part of the book, the whole second half of the book, became trying to understand that phenomenon and understand its effects. I call that half the locked in. So it's kind of like, it's hard to get in, but once you're in, you're in for good.
Gotcha, okay. Yeah, that's a very useful metaphor. And just in terms of like the costs of this sort of regulation, how does licensing impact how many services are provided? You already alluded a little bit to that, but what about the pricing of those services?
Yeah, so we know that licensing raises wages, which is why professionals want that kind of that regulation, because it can increase their wages. Well, when we're talking about services, then higher wages means higher prices for consumers, and this has been very well documented by economists. The number is a little bit harder to estimate, and it also depends on the profession, but it's somewhere around 10%. Which is greater than the state sales tax. So we're adding a premium with licensure, and as I said before, that comes from, or is correlated with, scarcity of those services. And the chapter of my book where I really explore what it means to make services scarcer is one where I focus on the COVID pandemic, and I talk about what happened when a professional workforce in medicine, made too small by licensing, kind of confronted this pandemic, and the real tragedies that happened when the regulatory failures that had been years and years in the making confronted a world in which we just didn't have enough providers, and so that's a consequence too: high prices and also scarcity.
Okay. So something else that you advocate for is reducing professional self-regulation and increasing government oversight. So can you just elaborate a little bit more on those aspects of your book and maybe what you envision the problem is there?
Yeah, so with self-regulation, I kind of expected the antitrust problems, the locked-out problems. But I also attribute the problem of locked in, the inability to kind of kick people out of your profession, to that self-regulation. So I, for some research that preceded the book, I found almost all the 2,000 licensing boards in the US. And I found that by statute, almost all of them are to be dominated by members of the profession, currently licensed working people in the profession, volunteering as regulators a couple days a month, a couple days a year. And the problem with this is twofold. One, they have the perspective of that profession. They're not thinking as much about public protection, at least the way that you and I might think about public protection. And two, they're very inexpert at what you might want them to be expert in, which is regulation. Understanding the consequences of the rules that they make, understanding the bad side of their profession. Because all of us, think only about the very best of our profession. We don't really know or understand how people who are inclined to kind of abuse their power operate. But if you were a regulator, if you really kind of understood the worst of the worst, you might make different decisions. So yeah, my solution is to reduce this kind of self-regulation, to change the composition of the boards to be less dominated by the profession, and or make those boards advisory to somebody in state government, basically a bureaucrat, somebody who has the perspective of a regulator. Give them the power to decide these cases and decide these rules. I noticed when I was going to these hearings, when something that I perceived as sort of wild was happening, it was the state staff that was there and working full-time for the state that seemed to be kind of like slapping their foreheads along with me. They seemed to be like, oh, please don't do this, board, please, oh, please. But they did, because they, the board had the power and the bureaucrat didn't. So I think that for the professions that we need it for, so we haven't talked much about my critique of how we license too many professions and we ought not to do professional licensing for lots of professions. But for the ones where we need it, we need to have the state take more responsibility for the regulation.
All right, and just as a final question for a lot of our viewers, who I'm sure would identify as American consumers, if you're speaking to the average American consumer, what is one thing, or maybe one or two things that you hope that they take away from your book or learn from it?
So licensing is not a win-win proposition. This is the way that the professions kind of sell it to legislators. They say, look, it's good for us, it's good for our profession, and it's good for the public. That's not true. It is not always unambiguously good for the public. And handing it over to the professions themselves is not good for the public either, because they will go too far when it comes to rules, and they will not go far enough when it comes to discipline to keep us safe. And then the other thing I would like people to know is that this is not very good regulation. You cannot rely on the idea that your doctor has a license to keep you safe. So, for example, I actually just this morning found this doctor who has, I think it's 72 state licensing board disciplinary decisions against him. He had 32 licenses in 32 different states. He's lost 12 of those, but he still has 20. And he has all these licensing board disciplinary decisions. And if you go to his website, it's welcome to our new medical director, licensed in 20 states. And it's easy to look at that website and say, oh, this guy's got it together. This guy's going to be a safe provider. So just understand that the licensing system it's a facade on a system that really is pretty broken.
All right. Well, that was very enlightening. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you guys for being here with us. We'll see you next time on Professors in Conversation.
Thank you.